January 1986. A freezing wind swept across the jagged peaks of Kunar province, carrying with it the distant thumping of rotor blades, deep, rhythmic, and terrifying. Every Mujahideen fighter in the valley knew that sound. It was the sound of death descending from the sky. Inside a narrow mountain pass, hidden beneath layers of rock and snow, a dozen Afghan fighters pressed their backs against the cold stone. Their bodies were tense, their breaths shallow. These men had spent years fighting the Soviets, but the weapon approaching had broken the spirit of thousands before them. The Mi-24 Hind, the Soviet Union's infamous flying tank. To the guerrillas, the Hind was not merely a helicopter. It was a monster, armored like a fortress, fast like a jet, and armed to the teeth. Twin Izotov engines screamed as the aircraft cut through the valley. Its chin-mounted gun swept the terrain, ready to tear apart anything unfortunate enough to move. The Soviets believed that nothing the Mujahideen possessed could bring down a Hind, and for years they were right. The fighters had tried everything: old DSHK heavy machine guns, clunky SA-7 Grails, even captured Soviet Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns dragged by mules into the mountains. Nothing worked reliably. The Hind's thick armor shrugged off small-caliber fire. Its infrared countermeasures, flares, jammers, heat baffles fooled most early missile systems. To the Soviet command in Kabul, these helicopters were symbols of domination. They executed troop insertions, provided fire support, and punished rebel villages with brutal efficiency. Their crews flew with arrogance, often dipping low over villages to terrorize civilians. Inside a smoky Soviet field headquarters near Bagram Air Base, officers laughed at CIA-supplied weapons, dismissing them as Western toys for shepherds. Reports of new American systems being funneled through Pakistan were brushed aside. Soviet generals were convinced nothing handheld could threaten the Hind, but they were wrong. Very wrong. Weeks earlier, in a walled-off compound in Pakistan's tribal belt, a quiet meeting had changed the trajectory of the war. A CIA officer placed a long, olive-green launch tube onto a straw mat. Around him, veteran Afghan commanders leaned in, their eyes narrow with suspicion. "This," the American whispered, "is the FIM-92 Stinger." The Afghans exchanged doubtful glances. They had seen foreign weapons fail before. But this one looked different. The tube was light, barely 15 kilograms, and perfectly balanced. Its guidance unit hummed softly as a cooling system dropped the seeker head to cryogenic temperatures. The display blinked to life, and a steady tone filled the room as the sight locked onto the heat of a nearby lantern. The Mujahideen commander Ahmad Shah Massoud studied the device carefully. His fighters had died by the hundreds under Hind rocket strikes. He understood the stakes better than anyone. "Can it kill the flying fortress?" he finally asked. The American didn't hesitate. It was built for it. The Stinger was unlike anything the region had seen. No external radar guidance. No cables. No complicated firing procedures. Just point, lock, fire. And its seeker? A dual-band infrared array capable of ignoring Soviet flares, something no previous Afghan missile had been able to do. Still, skepticism lingered. Soviet aircraft had spent years humiliating Afghan gunners. Many wondered if the Americans were overselling their miracle weapon. That doubt faded the moment the fighters lifted the Stinger. It felt powerful, purposeful, deadly. And this morning, in the frozen valley of Kunar, fate decided to test it. The Hind roared closer, its rotors chopping the air like a thunderous drumbeat. The Mujahideen braced for the usual, rockets raining down, the earth shaking, men fleeing for their lives. But today, something different waited in the rocks. A single fighter, his hands trembling with equal parts fear and adrenaline, hoisted the unfamiliar launch tube onto his shoulder. He steadied his breathing. He waited for the lock. The Hind appeared, huge, armored, invincible. The missile seeker beeped, once, twice. then a solid, unwavering tone. The fighter whispered a prayer and squeezed the trigger. A blinding flash erupted from the tube, and the Stinger shot into the sky like a spear of white fire. It carved a perfect arc toward the helicopter, accelerating past Mach 2 in seconds. The Soviet pilot saw it too late. There was no time for evasive maneuvers, no chance to outrun it. No countermeasure strong enough to break the lock. The missile struck the Hind's engine housing, punching through the protective plating and detonating deep inside its heart. The explosion ripped the aircraft open, flames spiraling from its fuselage as debris scattered across the valley. The flying tank fell from the sky. For the first time, the Mujahideen did not run. For the first time, they did not feel helpless. They watched the smoking wreckage crash into the mountainside. And in that moment, something profound shifted, not just in Afghanistan, but in Moscow. Because the myth of Soviet air invincibility had just died. October 1986. A month had passed since the first Stinger missile ripped apart the Mi-24 Hind, and already, the Mujahideen were beginning to see the Soviets react, though they couldn't know just how much fear their first kill had stirred in the Soviet command. At first, the Soviet response was denial. Soviet intelligence officers dismissed the loss of the Hind as a fluke, a lucky shot that could be attributed to poor piloting or malfunction. The Mi-24, after all, was a beast of a machine, with thick composite armor and an array of countermeasures that had previously shrugged off even the most potent surface-to-air missiles. The Soviets had been flying low and slow for years, confident that their aircraft were immune to such threats. But as the weeks passed, something changed. The first kill was quickly followed by others. Another Mi-24, then a Mi-8, and another Mi-24. Soviet command centers, once confident in the overwhelming superiority of their aircraft, were now reporting increasing air losses. Reports came in from Afghanistan, pilots terrified of the sudden invisible threat that could appear from any ridge, any hidden valley. The Mujahideen were now fighting not just with rifles and explosives, but with a weapon that could bring down Soviet might from miles away. It was clear that something had shifted. In a high-rise office in Moscow, deep inside the headquarters of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, a group of senior generals sat in a tense silence, looking at a map of Afghanistan. The casualties had risen, no longer just isolated incidents, but a growing pattern that was too significant to ignore. Every report mentioned the same thing: a sudden fast-moving missile strike and a helicopter falling from the sky. One general slammed his fist on the table. "This cannot be happening," he muttered, staring at the figures. "We've lost how many?" 17 Mi-24s, came the response. The voice of the intelligence officer trembled slightly. Plus 11 Mi-8. More than 100 sorties lost to this missile. The generals exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't just a challenge to Soviet air superiority. It was an attack on the very backbone of Soviet operations. The Mi-24 was no longer untouchable. The Stinger, with its high rate of success, was starting to change the rules of the game. It was no longer just a threat to a single aircraft. It was now a systemic problem. Back in Afghanistan, in a darkened cave deep in the mountains, the Mujahideen fighters, emboldened by their early victories, began to strategize with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew the Soviets would fight back. They always did. But they also knew that now, they had something that could not be ignored. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, one of the Mujahideen's most influential commanders, stood before his commanders. His words were harsh, but there was a fire in his eyes, one that had been kindled by the fall of the first Hind. "We now have a weapon they fear," Hekmatyar declared, his voice low and steady. "This is not a fluke. This is the future of our fight." But the Mujahideen were no strangers to fear. The Soviet response would not be swift or simple. They had already begun to adapt their tactics, forcing their pilots to fly lower, almost skimming the ground to avoid missile lock-ons. This strategy, known as nap of the earth flying, was meant to bring them closer to the terrain, where they could maneuver more effectively, but also where they risked hitting the mountainside or crashing into obstacles. The Soviets were also tightening their formations, trying to increase the odds that if one Hind was shot down, others could provide mutual support. But the Stinger missile's infrared seeker was a precision weapon. It locked onto the heat of the engine, and the Hind's large twin engines were not easy to hide, even against the backdrop of the rugged Afghan landscape. The Stinger didn't care about countermeasures or flares. It simply followed the hottest source of infrared energy. But what really terrified the Soviet brass was the shift in morale. In the past, Soviet pilots flew over the Afghan mountains with near impunity. They were the invincible. Now they were the prey. The kill rate of Soviet aircraft had spiked dramatically, and the psychological toll on Soviet forces was undeniable. Reports began circulating in Soviet headquarters that pilots were refusing missions. Desertion started climbing. By 1987, at least 20% of the pilots in Afghanistan had refused to fly or had deserted their posts. The psychological damage done by the Stinger was significant. No longer could Soviet pilots fly with the certainty of success. The once feared Hind was now seen as a vulnerable target, a sitting duck waiting for a Stinger to fly up from the mountains and end its life. In the Mujahideen's mountain hideouts, word of the missile's success spread like wildfire. Fighters, once terrified of the Soviet airstrikes, now stood taller, eyes burning with the belief that they could win. The tables were beginning to turn. Even as the Soviets pushed for countermeasures to address the Stinger, like infrared jamming pods and decoy flares, they were playing catch-up. The technology was already in the hands of the Mujahideen, and it was proving deadly. April 1987. The Soviets were no longer dismissing the threat. Every day, another Mi-24 Hind was lost to the silent, deadly Stinger missile. Soviet pilots, once confident and fearless, now flew with a growing unease. Their beloved flying tanks were being ripped from the sky at an unprecedented rate, and the toll on their forces was becoming unbearable. The situation in Afghanistan had turned into a nightmare for the Soviet air forces. No matter how many precautions they took, no matter how much countermeasures they deployed, the Stinger missile seemed to find its mark every time. Soviet pilots, who had once dominated the skies, now had to contend with an invisible enemy, one that could strike at any moment, from anywhere. Inside the Soviet Ministry of Defense, the panic was palpable. At a critical meeting in Moscow, a senior officer from the Soviet General Staff stood before a room filled with military brass, his face grim. The casualty reports were devastating. "We've lost nearly 100 aircraft in the last 6 months alone," he reported, his voice heavy. "And this doesn't count the aircraft down by other means, only the Stingers." General Sergei Akhromeyev, one of the Soviet Union's top military leaders, leaned forward, his face tight with frustration. "We must do something. We can't afford to lose more helicopters. The Afghan fighters have already adapted to the low-altitude tactics. We must consider another solution." The room was silent. The Mi-24 Hind had been the pride of Soviet aviation, a weapon of war designed to dominate the battlefield. But now it was being picked off by guerrilla fighters with nothing more than a lightweight, shoulder-fired missile. In the wake of the mounting losses, the Soviets were forced to rethink their strategy. The Mi-24, which had once flown with arrogant ease, was now vulnerable. Soviet pilots were forced to adopt new tactics, including flying even lower to the ground, barely skimming the rugged terrain. This nap-of-the-earth tactic was meant to reduce exposure to incoming missiles, but it came with its own set of risks. Flying just above the Earth's surface increased the danger of crash landings from sudden terrain obstacles, and more pilots were dying from crashes than ever before. Mi-24s had been built for the open skies, not the cramped, treacherous mountains of Afghanistan. And the Stinger missile, with its remarkable precision, was no longer just a nuisance. It had evolved into a game-changer, a tool that the Mujahideen could wield with deadly accuracy. By the summer of 1987, the Stinger had become a key part of the Mujahideen arsenal, and Soviet forces had no choice but to adapt or be destroyed. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Soviet Union's military superiority was in question. The Mi-24 Hind, a helicopter once thought invulnerable, was now being systematically dismantled by Afghan resistance fighters. The scale of the Stinger's impact began to reveal itself more clearly. Soviet aircraft losses skyrocketed. By the end of 1987, it was reported that 150 to 200 Mi-24 Hind helicopters had been shot down, and the Afghan resistance was just getting started. The CIA had already equipped the Mujahideen with a substantial number of Stinger missiles, and by the end of the year, over 10,000 missiles had made their way into the hands of the fighters. In the mountains of Afghanistan, Ahmad Shah Massoud, the legendary commander of the Jamiat-Islami, surveyed the battlefield from a hidden ridge. The wind had kicked up, carrying the acrid smell of gunpowder and smoke from the latest skirmish. The Mujahideen had lost men, hundreds of them, but they had gained something far more valuable: the ability to strike at the heart of the Soviet war machine. The Stinger had transformed them from a ragtag militia into a formidable force. With every Mi-24 that fell from the sky, the Soviets' grip on the region grew weaker. Massoud knew that they couldn't afford to stop now. The momentum was building, and the Soviets had no answer to the Stinger. "They can't keep this up," Massoud muttered to his commanders, his gaze fixed on the distant valley where Soviet helicopters often appeared. "We've turned the tide. Now we push forward." Meanwhile, inside the Soviet General Staff's headquarters, the pressure was mounting. Soviet intelligence began to notice disturbing trends. The Mujahideen's tactics had shifted from simple ambush to coordinated, sophisticated attacks. No longer were they content to fire from the shadows. They were hunting. And the Mi-24 Hind was the prey. The Soviet Air Force began to scale back operations in Afghanistan, delaying sorties and consolidating their assets. The air war, once a key part of the Soviet strategy, was now proving too costly. The psychological toll on the Soviet pilots was immense. Fear had crept into the ranks. Veteran pilots began to refuse dangerous missions, and in some cases, entire units were grounded after losing too many aircraft. In response, the Kremlin authorized more drastic measures. They began pouring resources into developing countermeasures specifically to defeat the Stinger threat. They enhanced their infrared jammers and began retrofitting their aircraft with decoy flares in even larger quantities. But these efforts came too late. The Stinger missile had already changed the balance of power. The Soviets were no longer in control of the skies, and no amount of countermeasures could restore their dominance. The Stinger had forced the Soviet Union into a corner. The 40th Army had been stretched thin across Afghanistan, and their once dominant air force was now crippled. General Akromayev's warnings echoed in the halls of the Politburo. "The losses in the air are unacceptable. Our pilots are being slaughtered." Soviet morale was faltering. It wasn't just the loss of aircraft. It was the knowledge that they were fighting against a weapon that seemed to defy logic, one that made their technological advantage meaningless. They had underestimated the Stinger, and now they were paying the price. February 1989. The last Soviet soldiers were filing out of Afghanistan, retreating in defeat. Behind them, the once dominant Soviet Air Force, crippled by the relentless Mujahideen and the deadly FIM-92 Stinger missile, limped back home. The mountains of Afghanistan had claimed another victory, and this time, it wasn't just another guerrilla skirmish. It was a strategic military defeat that had forced the Soviet Union to abandon its decade-long occupation. In the years that followed, the impact of the Stinger missile would continue to reverberate across military doctrines, shaping the future of warfare in ways that no one in 1986 could have fully predicted. The Stinger was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of the power of asymmetric warfare, a testament to how a small, nimble force, armed with the right technology, could take on and defeat a global superpower. The Soviets, whose military doctrine had long been based on the belief that technological superiority would win the day, now had to reckon with the fact that even the most advanced military machines could be brought down by a single man with a shoulder-fired missile. The Mi-24 Hind, once seen as the ultimate weapon of air superiority, had been neutralized by the very people it was meant to crush. Soviet military leaders, once confident in their ability to control the skies, now had to re-examine their entire approach to warfare. The loss of hundreds of aircraft, the destruction of nearly 200 Mi-24 Hinds, and the erosion of morale among their pilots and ground troops had created a situation that was untenable. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev and his Politburo advisors made the final decision to withdraw, the Soviets had lost more than just a war. They had lost the credibility of their military might. The withdrawal began in May 1988, and by February 1989, the Soviet Union had completed its retreat from Afghanistan. The Mujahideen, who had been outgunned, outnumbered, and often outclassed in terms of technology, had emerged victorious. The Stinger missile had leveled the playing field and turned the tide of the war. It had changed the calculus of modern warfare and highlighted the growing vulnerability of even the most advanced military forces in the face of cheap, effective countermeasures. The significance of the Stinger's role in the Afghan victory was not lost on military analysts and historians. Steve Call, in his seminal book Ghost Wars, noted that the Stinger had tipped the scales in favor of the Afghan resistance, shortening the war by 1 to 2 years. The Soviet Union, already stretched thin from the political and economic pressures of the Cold War, could no longer afford the massive expenditure needed to maintain its military presence in Afghanistan. The Stinger had dealt a fatal blow to the Soviet military's ability to sustain its war effort. In the years that followed, the Stinger missile became a symbol of U.S. technological supremacy, one that could empower small, nimble forces to challenge even the most formidable adversaries. The missile would go on to be used in other conflicts, from the Gulf War in 1991 to the Ukraine conflict in 2022, where it helped Ukrainian forces down Russian aircraft. The Stinger was proof that in the modern world, technology could change the rules of warfare, even when the forces involved were asymmetrical in nature. For the Soviets, the impact of the Stinger went beyond just the battlefield. The psychological toll of seeing their aircraft destroyed from miles away by a single shot shattered the myth of Soviet invincibility. Soviet generals, once proud of their air force's dominance, now had to contend with the fact that the Mujahideen had not only held their ground, but had taken the fight to the skies. The Kremlin's inability to effectively counter the Stinger left a lasting scar on their military reputation. As for the Mujahideen, the arrival of the Stinger marked the turning point in their struggle. They had gone from being underdogs, surviving on scraps of weapons and outdated equipment, to a force capable of striking at the heart of the Soviet war machine. The Stinger provided them with the confidence and the means to challenge a superpower. The knowledge that they could shoot down Soviet aircraft, long seen as untouchable, became a powerful rallying cry for their cause. The United States, for its part, had achieved a significant victory in the Cold War. The CIA's Operation Cyclone, which had funneled weapons and aid to the Afghan resistance, had paid off. The Stinger, though just one part of a broader strategy, had proven to be the decisive element in turning the tide. The United States had managed to provide the right technology at the right moment, and the consequences were felt not only in Afghanistan but across the global balance of power. As the Soviets withdrew, the global military landscape began to shift. The Stinger was not just a weapon, it was a game-changer. It had proven that even the most powerful air forces were vulnerable, and it ushered in an era where the technological edge was no longer solely in the hands of superpowers. It empowered smaller nations and guerrilla forces, allowing them to confront conventional military giants on more equal terms. The legacy of the Stinger endures in the modern world. Upgraded versions of the missile, like the FIM-92 are still part of U.S. and Allied stockpiles. It remains one of the most effective short-range air defense systems in existence. More than just a weapon, it is a reminder of the changing nature of war, the moment when small, nimble forces proved that with the right technology, they could bring down even the mightiest of giants. The Stinger's impact on the Soviet-Afghan War was profound. It didn't just shift the balance of power, it changed the course of history. And for the Mujahideen, Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union, the Stinger missile remains a defining symbol of resistance, proving that even the most unlikely weapon could have the power to topple an empire.